Hi, I'm Jean Schumacher. Today, I have the privilege of connecting with Brenda Davis, the queen of vegan nutrition. She is a registered dietitian, a leader in her field, and an internationally acclaimed speaker. She's worked as a public health and clinical nutrition specialist. She's been an academic nutrition instructor and co-author of, I don't know, Brenda, what are you up to? About 100 books now?
13 and working on the 14th. We're actually almost done the 14th.
Thank you so much for taking the time to be here tonight.
Well, thank you for inviting me. It's really my pleasure to be here.
Well, for those of you who don't know, what inspired you to adopt a plant-based lifestyle and how has it influenced your practice as a registered dietitian?
The way that food animals were being raised and slaughtered really bothered me. I was concerned about environmental sustainability, especially with the growing population. And I was really convinced that people could reduce the risk of the chronic diseases that kill most of us consuming a more plant-based diet. So adopting this sort of plant-based lifestyle not only aligned with my personal values, but really reshaped my approach as a registered dietitian. So when I made this transition, I was actually a public health nutritionist. And I can tell you that at that time, vegetarian diets were considered risky and vegan diets were considered downright dangerous by most health professionals. I was worried that I would just be ousted from the profession if I became vegan. But I really thought about maybe I should look at another career because everything, like all of our nutrition education resources, I'm Canadian, but our resources were like Canada's Food Guide had 4 parts to a plate, and the top 2 were animal products, meat and dairy. And the bottom 2 were fruits and vegetables and grains. And so it just seemed almost impossible to go on this path. But I was really determined. I just thought, if I don't stay and try to change the system from within, who will, right? And so I got quite determined to try to change the narrative. What ended up happening was my colleagues ended up being very grateful for the resources I was creating, just providing evidence-based guidelines for plant-based consumers. I really wanted for people that saw the big picture, that wanted to live a more compassionate, sustainable lifestyle, that they would succeed brilliantly at every stage of life, for their children as they were seniors. And so I knew we needed resources for professionals so that people would be doing it properly. Because every time we see a failed vegan, especially if it's a child, it hits the headlines and people get really afraid to eat a more fully plant-based diet. So that's a little bit of my story anyway.
Diabetes. Wow, you've had a lot of experience in dealing with diabetes. First, let's start with the basics. Just what is diabetes?
Well, diabetes is really just a metabolic condition in which people have elevated blood glucose levels. And it's due to one of 2 things. With type 1 diabetes, of course, it's due to a pancreas that isn't pumping out enough insulin or may not be pumping out any insulin. Type 2 diabetes, it's that the body isn't effectively using the insulin it produces. And then over time, your insulin production actually starts to wane as well. Type 2 diabetes has been more the focus of my work, and it accounts for about 90 to 95% of cases. And it's really a disease of insulin resistance. So it's very strongly influenced by diet, physical activity, and body weight. Most people with type 2 diabetes are overweight, but not everyone. But what's really interesting is many of the people with type 2 diabetes who are not technically overweight are overweight for their bodies. So there's a personal fat threshold that people that are predisposed to diabetes, if they surpass that threshold, they end up with type 2 diabetes. And so they can have a BMI of 23 or 24, for example, but if they've got a small frame, and they tend to store excess fat in their abdominal area and in their liver and pancreas, then that drives insulin resistance and type 2 diabetes. And of course, over time, uncontrolled diabetes leads to some pretty serious complications like cardiovascular disease and kidney disease and neuropathy and vision loss and all of that. The good news is that this is a largely preventable disease. And in many cases, we can actually drive the disease into remission by making, pretty comprehensive lifestyle changes. And, unfortunately, people that have had the disease for 20 years or more, it's harder to drive the disease into remission. For people who have had it for, 4 or 5 years, it's easier, or even less than that, it's easier. So the longer you have it, the more damage occurs to the pancreas and the harder it becomes. But I have seen people who've had diabetes for 20 plus years actually go into remission with very significant lifestyle changes. So it's still possible.
A lot of it's diet related. I mean, really. You were the lead dietitian in the diabetes project in the Marshall Islands. A lot of people don't know about this incredible project. Talk to us about what happened here and what you did.
Yeah, so for people that want more information than what I'll share here, the results paper just came out in 2025 in Diabetologia, which is one of the biggest diabetes journals. And our protocol paper was released in 2019. So the results paper is now out, which I am just thrilled to bits with. The Marshall Islands, for those of you that have never even heard of the Marshall Islands, they're very remote islands, somewhere sort of halfway between Hawaii and Australia. And there's nothing within a couple of 1,000 miles in any direction. They're so remote that they were actually used as atomic bomb testing grounds after the Second World War. But these islands, they're like 1,200 islands, very small area, like 70 square miles. The main island is Majuro, which is 3.7 square miles and 30 miles long. This little long, skinny strip of coral atoll, and that's where the majority of people live. The Marshall Islands has among the highest rates of type 2 diabetes in the world. Close to 30% of adults are affected, and previously it was close to 35%. So it's starting to come down. The first part of my work there was actually in a randomized control trial, the first randomized control trial ever done in the Marshall Islands, and the first lifestyle trial ever done in Micronesia. And it was really quite a project. So we basically, came into this country and were given the TB and leprosy clinic to turn into a diabetes wellness center. And this clinic, it was just overrun with rats and cockroaches. It had 2 inches of rat droppings in the stainless steel medical cabinets. It was to say it was in disrepair would be an overstatement. We literally had to, transform it into a functioning wellness center, had to order all of our appliances and all of our kitchen tools and all the food and you name it. We had to randomize. We had all kinds of individuals who were tested for diabetes to see if they qualified to be part of this trial. And they were randomized to either the standard medical care or this intensive lifestyle medicine trial. People wanted to be in the trial, so they were very upset if they got randomized to the control. So basically, it was a 6-month program, 3 months of intensive education, and then 3 months of doing it on your own. And it was, culturally adapted. We had many Marshallese working with us who we trained. We used a whole food plant-based diet and exercise. We used all of the pillars of lifestyle medicine, or we educated about all of the pillars of lifestyle medicine. We provided, we did cooking classes and, grocery store tours and you name it, we did it. We got restaurants to have diabetes friendly, menu options, and grocery stores to actually bring in healthy foods and so forth. And the outcomes were actually pretty remarkable. Most of the people that were part of our program didn't think lifestyle had anything to do with diabetes. They just thought it was the, sort of the luck of the draw. It was maybe the radiation from the bombs. They really didn't think it had anything to do with lifestyle. They started seeing changes quickly. So, the pain went away, their heads were clearing, they weren't constipated anymore. And their blood glucose dropped on average 75 milligrams per deciliter in the first 2 weeks. Their A1C at 3 months was down on average 2 percentage points, which is just huge, more than any other study that I'm aware of, other than Joel Furman's study, which was very small and wasn't a randomized controlled trial, so isn't considered the same quality of study as this one was. 63% of our participants reduced their medications, and 23% of those who had an A1C under 9 actually achieved remission, which again is remarkable in a country like this where people live 16 people in one household and they're making one pot of rice and cracking open a can of Spam for dinner. The favorite food of the children, the favorite snack of the children was ramen noodles, eaten straight out of the package with Kool-Aid powder sprinkled on top. One time I saw a child, they were sprinkling the Kool-Aid powder on top, and after they finished, they cracked open this package of white powder and started sprinkling the powder on top. And I asked the Marshallese person next to me, I said, "What is that they're sprinkling on?" They said, "Oh, that's Ajinomoto." Well, Ajinomoto is pure MSG. So, these deep fried salty ramen noodles with Kool-Aid powder, color and flavor on top, and then pure MSG on top. You couldn't design a diet to induce diabetes better than the diet that these people have adopted. And 100 years ago, they had no type 2 diabetes. In the 1950s, there were 3 cases. They lived off the land. They ate fish and plants, and that was, almost all they ate. So today it's a very different story. After this trial finished, I continued to go back and do interventions for the government and the teachers and the police department and to other islands. And we went back. I was invited to create a school nutrition and health curriculum. So I went back and did that. And then in 2024, son and I just last year went back and did a training for the wellness center staff and for the president and her staff as well. And so we continue to do what we can to help the people of the Marshall Islands. And they are so lovely. I just found that they were the most joyful, fun-loving. They laughed constantly. They were so willing to eat whatever we prepared. They were just really lovely to work with. So that's the Marshall Islands story.
That is just absolutely incredible what you did. Just single-handedly changed the lives of these people. I mean,
Well, thank you so much, but it wasn't single-handedly. I will take credit for sort of designing the nutrition part of the program and all the recipes and, training the staff. Like our staff, they had never used a measuring cup or a measuring spoon. They didn't know the difference between a tablespoon and a teaspoon. It was, really starting from scratch. So it was quite an experience. A wonderful experience, but quite an experience.
yeah. Wow. I mean, so they were eating whole food plant-based. Did you have them eat more raw than cooked? And do you think
No, in this culture, what we really tried to do was design foods that would be appropriate for them. So if they had a favorite, dish like fish kalal, we would make a garbanzo kalal. We really tried to use foods that were relatively familiar. So pandanus and taro and breadfruit and things like that were part of their traditional diet. Coconut was a big part of their traditional diet. We used all of that because we wanted it to be culturally sensitive and sustainable. But we did bring in some unfamiliar foods. Like a lot of people had never eaten beans in their life. Beans or lentils were completely unfamiliar to them. Whole grains were completely unfamiliar. So a lot of fruits and vegetables were not that familiar either. So we tried to create recipes. I mean, they loved the food, but we tried to mix in things that were recognizable to them.
Excellent. Do you think it was more raw? I mean, and do you think raw helps more with diabetes to reverse it?
A raw food diet, in terms of diabetes reversal, is really powerful because you're eliminating processed foods. A lot of the things that have a negative impact are just automatically eliminated. Doing a fairly high raw is a pretty powerful therapeutic tool for sure.
Well, what common misconceptions do people have about plant-based diets?
Well, I think there's still a lot of misconceptions. There were more in the past, but I think one of the most pervasive is the idea that plant-based diets are inherently lacking in protein, iron, calcium, and long chain omega-3s and all of these kinds of nutrients. I think the second is that these diets are bland, boring, they won't fill you up, they're just unsatisfying. And some people also believe that plant-based diets are just too expensive or time-consuming. Of course, the reality is that a well-planned plant-based diet can be nutritionally complete, flavorful, affordable, and very satisfying. There are a lot of health organizations, including the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics, that recognize that appropriately planned vegetarian and vegan diets are healthful and nutritionally adequate at every stage of life. So a lot of these misconceptions, I think we really have the evidence to say you really don't have to worry about these things.
No, I hear a lot of the same things. Oh, I can't give up XYZ. I'm not disciplined, and on and on. But, well, how do you recommend transitioning to a plant-based diet for someone who's new?
Well, I think it depends on the person and what their motivation is. I would generally recommend to start by increasing your intake of whole plant foods that you already like fruits and vegetables and legumes and whole grains and nuts and seeds. Just adding them. It's easier for people to add things than take away things at the beginning. And then I would say you might want to start if you want to go slowly and you don't want to just do it overnight, begin by making one meal a day plant-based and just build from there. And I think breakfast is probably the easiest because all you really have to do is swap out your dairy milk for non-dairy milk and your eggs for scrambled tofu. And, it's a pretty easy meal to navigate. I think it's easy to do plant-based lunches as well. If you're doing sandwich lunches, it's a little more challenging, but I love salad lunches. And I think doing a full meal salad with beans or tofu for protein and some sort of grain, quinoa or steamed sweet potatoes or something for your starch, and then having a really good whole food dressing that's got some fat in it, like tahini or hemp seeds, something like that, that helps you to absorb all of the nutrients from that salad is a really wonderful lunch meal. And dinner, I think for a lot of people is a little more challenging, but I think people can start just by, making plant-based versions of familiar favorites. And that's a really easy thing to do. If you love spaghetti and meatballs, you do spaghetti and no meatballs. There are lots of plant-based versions of ethnic foods, so Mexican or Japanese or Chinese or whatever. There's so many cultures that have for many generations relied mainly on plants. I mean, we can just learn from those cultures, and their foods are often just incredibly delicious. So I think that's a good way to start. And then, it's really important to make sure that the meals are balanced and nutrient dense. And it generally means including a wide variety of foods, but it also means, to me, including something from every food group at each meal and making meals as colorful as possible. Of course, education is key. You need to understand how to meet nutrient needs, how to prepare simple meals, how to navigate social situations. Like, what do you do at Thanksgiving? What do you do when you're having people over or you're going to someone's house for dinner? Those things can be really challenging for people. And so just, learning and figuring out ways of navigating those that are comfortable and doable for you. In many cases, you may need to supplement some nutrients that might fall short, like vitamin B12 or vitamin D, possibly long chain omega 3s. So, those are all things that need to be considered.
There's a lot to learn. There's a lot to learn. You've been studying this your whole life. And I think it's kind of tossing out everything we learned. Growing up, it was animal products. We had milk in the refrigerator, whole milk for that matter, orange juice and water in my fridge growing up. And
Yeah,
that was it. I mean, we had meat with every meal.
we had baked beans, it was with hot dogs or something like that, right?
No, there were very few. I don't even remember any, honestly. There was always some kind of meat on the plate. We had a question from one of our viewers. She says, I'm 73, 100% whole food plant-based, 5 years. My ferritin level is found low at 14, not anemic. With supplements, it's now okay. Her question is this finding abnormal following a whole food plant-based?
We know that people who eat whole food plant-based diet tend to have low serum ferritin levels. If they're within range, they're not below what is considered to be an acceptable range, then it may actually end up being an advantage. Slightly lower serum ferritin levels are associated with lower risk of chronic disease, but you don't want to be so low that you are putting yourself at risk in terms of iron deficiency. Iron is a super important nutrient, and it's very, very important for cognition of children. Children that are born prematurely, children that are not eating a good balanced diet with lots of legumes and seeds and so forth may fall short in iron. And it's just really, really important that if they do, that we supplement with iron to ensure that they don't fall. If they're born prematurely, they need a supplement of 1 to 3 milligrams per kilogram body weight. And if they don't get that, it can actually permanently damage their cognition. And so that's not something to fool around with. So we do need to make sure we're getting sufficient iron. And that there are ways of playing with the diet to boost iron levels. And one is to be really conscious of choosing high iron foods at each meal. So in the legume family, the most concentrated sources are soybeans and lentils. Chickpeas are pretty good as well. In the seed family, the most concentrated sources are pumpkin seeds and hemp seeds, I would say, are probably close to the top. Leafy greens are also, some grains are reasonable iron sources. Some nuts are reasonable iron sources. And generally, with non-heme iron, which is the type of iron in plants, absorption is enhanced when you consume your food with good sources of vitamin C. So peppers and strawberries and vegetables and fruits generally, it helps increase absorption levels. And also even things like ginger and turmeric and carrots, the carotenoids can actually help with iron absorption as well. One of the things where we see more problems with iron are where people are sprinkling a lot of phytates on their food. So, they put bran on everything because they have problems with constipation, or they think bran is a really good thing to be adding. But when you add bran, you're adding like a little phytate bomb, and it reduces absorption of trace minerals quite significantly. So generally, if you're eating a whole food plant-based diet, you don't need to be adding more phytates. We have plenty of phytates. We don't need to be adding concentrated phytates. For people that come from cultures that use flatbreads, yeasting helps to reduce phytates. So when you eat a lot of flatbreads, you're not going to be absorbing trace minerals quite as well either. Soaking, sprouting, all help to reduce phytate levels as well.
I just have to share with you, I'm a former chemistry teacher. I don't know if you knew that or not, but I would take Cheerios, grind it up in a mortar and pestle, and then take a magnetic stirrer, a magnet that goes along with the magnetic stirrer, and just stir the Cheerios, the ground up Cheerios, with just some water, and it's put it on stir. The kids walk in. You never knew what you were going to get in my class. Anyway, so they're walking in to the class. They're like, "What's going on? What's this?" You'll find out. And about, I don't know, 10 minutes later, I pull the magnet out and it's covered in what? Iron, because Cheerios are fortified with iron.
Wow, that's interesting. Oh, the kids must have loved that.
You're like, what? I'm like, yeah, that 57 Chevy, we just ground it up and put it in your Cheerios. So, what are some of the essential nutrients to pay attention to in a plant-based diet or lifestyle?
Well, I think first and foremost is B12 because vitamin B12 is not naturally present in most plant foods. I mean, there's a, maybe a little bit in mushrooms if they're grown in manure, and they're not washed well. There may be a little bit in seaweed, but when we dry seaweed, a lot of vitamin B12 cornoids are actually converted into inactive cornoids from active to inactive. And so you can't really rely on even things like tempeh. It's possible for tempeh to have B12 if it's been fermented in sort of unclean wooden vats that are contaminated with bacteria. But generally, we've removed B12 from these foods because we're concerned about sanitation. And so the way that we produce tempeh in North America and just the way that we try to clean our foods to prevent pathogenic bacteria from getting into the food system, we're also reducing B12. So there are really only two reliable sources to get B12. One is from B12 fortified foods, like if you're drinking a fortified non-dairy milk or taking a supplement. And probably the most reliable is supplement. 1,000 micrograms twice a week is enough for most adults. Seniors, a lot of people recommend 500 to 1,000 micrograms a day, just because their ability to absorb nutrients is reduced. And if you're on metformin, metformin reduces B12 absorption as well. So then they would need probably to be at that higher level as well. And then above and beyond B12, vitamin D is an issue. And I have to say that I have even been involved in children with rickets, and the parents are in trouble because of that. They end up with vitamin D deficiency. There are just simply fewer sources of vitamin D in plant-based diets. So mushrooms, this is an interesting story because mushrooms, if they're grown in sunlight, they are exceptional vitamin D sources. I mean, you can take mushrooms that you buy from the grocery store. So just regular button mushrooms or portobello or whatever, put them on a cookie sheet, gills up, expose them to the sun for 10 or 15, 20 minutes, and their vitamin D level will just go through the roof. You'll get way more vitamin D in a serving of those mushrooms than what you need for the day. So that's a way of doing it, especially it has to be warm sunshine, of course. But generally, when we think about vitamin D, it's for omnivores, it's coming from eggs and fish and milk that's fortified. For us, we have plant-based milks that are fortified if we're using those. But many people don't. They make their own or don't use the fortified products. And so they're not getting a lot of vitamin D in their diet. And so, sunlight is an option, but I live in Canada. There's probably 7 or 8 months of the year where we don't make any vitamin D because it has to be warm sunshine. And even if you're exposed, there was a study done in Hawaii looking at people that were exposed to an equivalent of 11 hours of sunshine a week, and their levels still weren't optimal. So many people do need to supplement to hit the sort of targets, and especially if they live in normal climates. And targets are, probably 30 to 50 nanograms per mil is reasonable. We're not wanting it to go above 150 nanograms per mil because that can lead to calcemia, which can cause hardening of the arteries and such. But generally 30 to 50, I think, is a really good place to shoot for. A lot of tables will say anything over 20, but I think 30 is a safer bet in my view. And that's, I think, a reasonable place for most people. And for some people, taking 1,000 to 2,000 IUs a day will do the trick. They'll be able to reach those targets. My writing partner, Vasanto, who's 83, actually had to go to 4,000 IUs a day to get to that target. So it differs for different people. So just to be aware of that. Calcium is another nutrient that we tend to fall short of on plant-based diets. And, I'm really careful about calcium, and I hit the targets. Some people say we don't need to get to the RDA, but it's probably a reasonable thing to try to aim in that direction at the very least. The main sources of calcium, and we've seen a link between low calcium intakes and increased fracture risk. And there's no question. If you look at the diseases and the rates of diseases among vegans compared to vegetarians compared to omnivores, we do better in almost everything except osteoporosis. We do worse where osteoporosis and fractures are concerned. And that's probably because we're leaner. So leaner people tend to have more fractures. But it may also be because we don't consume as much calcium, vitamin D, protein, and some of the other nutrients like B12 that are associated with bone health. Calcium fortified plant milk, tofu made with calcium, low oxalate greens. The high oxalate greens are beet greens, spinach, and Swiss chard, which you can't rely on as calcium sources because you just don't absorb much calcium from those greens. But kale and broccoli and bok choy and most of the Chinese greens are pretty good calcium sources. Almonds, chia seeds are remarkably high in calcium, and unhulled sesame seeds. So black sesame seeds tend to be unhulled, whereas white sesame seeds tend to be hulled. So generally, you get a lot more calcium. You get about 100 milligrams of calcium from a tablespoon of unhulled sesame seeds, black or white. Some legumes are decent sources, figs. There are quite a few calcium sources. So certainly we can meet our calcium needs. Another one that I am concerned with is iodine. So especially if you're a raw food eater and you don't consume any seaweed. So, in omnivorous diets, dairy products, seafood, eggs are all primary sources of iodine. And that's largely due to animal feed fortification and iodine-containing sanitizers used in dairy processing. So we clean cows' teats with iodine to sanitize the teats. And that's why dairy products have iodine. Iodine content of plant foods varies depending on the iodine in the soil. And many regions have low iodine content of soil. And so most vegans have lower intakes of iodine than omnivores. However, if you consume seaweed, you may have very high intakes of iodine. So just a 1/16 of a teaspoon of kelp powder gives you the 150 micrograms of iodine you need each day. A larger amounts of dulse and, those kinds of seaweed, just a small sprinkle of kelp will get you to where you need to be. But people need to know that the upper limit of iodine is 1,100 micrograms. And that, a half a teaspoon of kelp and you're at the upper limit. So you have to just be really cautious about the way you use those seaweeds. Some people can rely on iodized salt. If you use a little bit of salt, you can use iodized sea salt, for example. Non-iodized salts are very low in iodine. So just to be, aware of that. And then the other nutrient that I think deserves mention is the long-chain omega-3 fatty acids, EPA and DHA. And many vegans or 100% plant-based eaters rely on conversion of alpha-linolenic acid to EPA and DHA. And alpha-linolenic acid comes from hemp seeds and flax seeds and chia seeds and walnuts and those foods. And certainly we can convert some alpha linolenic acid, but conversion is highly inefficient unless you're a young woman who's sort of the age where you can get pregnant. And then your conversion is a little more efficient. It's not efficient for men. It's not efficient for postmenopausal women. And the average vegan probably has an omega-3 index of around 3 to 4%. And this sort of optimal is at least 6%, closer to 8%. And so to get there, in my experience, it takes about 500 to 1,000 milligrams of EPA and DHA for most adults to actually hit that target. And there have been some studies coming out, like one of the latest Adventist Health Study 2s, showing some possible concerns about cognitive function in very old vegans and those that are 85 plus. So it's something to be aware of. And so I think it's a very reasonable thing to supplement. I just had my omega-3 index done, supplementing, not very consistently. And it was, I think, 5.9%, which is pretty decent for a vegan. But I've upped my intake, and I'm being more consistent with what I'm taking, because I'd like it to be closer to the 8%. So that's the other one that I think is worth mentioning. And of course, things like iron and zinc and selenium can all be issues for some people. But generally, if you're consuming a wide variety of plant foods, you will get enough of those nutrients. And even some people worry about choline, and again, it's including the variety and including nuts and seeds. I think when people remove the nuts and seeds, it gets harder to get sufficient amounts of those trace nutrients.
Well, that was pretty thorough. Well done there. So, and just circling back to the iodine, because a lot of people don't realize how much that you do need to have that iodine. A lot of issues with thyroid are related to your iodine.
Absolutely. It is. And just while we're on the topic of iodine, a lack of iodine is the number one cause of severe cognitive dysfunction in children worldwide, globally. It causes very, very severe cognitive impairment. And for adults, it can cause issues as well, and especially for pregnant and lactating women. So we really have to be careful of iodine. A lack of iodine can cause hypothyroidism. It's problematic. We need thyroid hormones, and we can't make thyroid hormones without iodine. It's really simple. We need to make sure we have a source.
Well, and just thinking about when you look at the periodic table and you look at group 7A, the halogens, you're looking at fluorine, which is the most electronegative element on the periodic table. And then below that is chlorine. And both of those things have in a single displacement chemical reaction, they can kick out iodine and displace it. So if you're dealing with fluoridated water, could that be a problem too? With dealing with thyroid, or if you're swimming in a chlorinated pool. So just wanted to throw those things out there too.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. Okay, I've got a question for you because one of the members of the Plant-Based Academy, she has been plant-based for 21 years and transitioned 100% because you have written quite a few books on raw. So she's kind of concerned about this. So she transitioned 100% raw about 9 months ago. And she wants to make sure that she's getting everything she needs because she refuses to eat any cooked foods. So she just wants to be healthy, you know.
How old is she?
In her 70s.
Okay.
So, and she looks magnificent, honestly. She looks like she's glowing, But I think the biggest concern is, and I know we have always have this concern about protein, but if she's eating raw, is she able to get enough protein again in her diet? Is there anything else she should be concerned about?
When you eat a 100% raw diet, you can meet your nutritional needs, and it can be so effective therapeutically. But it really does require careful planning because it's harder to get enough protein, iron, zinc, There's no source of B12, vitamin D, calcium, iodine if you're not eating seaweed. And the other thing is, for some people, we see excessive weight loss. We see for younger women, there have been studies showing as much as 50% of them end up with amenorrhea, which is their period stops. They end up with a greatly increased risk of osteoporosis when that happens. So there are some things that we really need to be conscious of. And so I wouldn't recommend 100% raw diet for vulnerable individuals, especially children and pregnant women. For seniors, because they have a little tougher time absorbing nutrients, protein can be an issue on a raw diet. And I would suggest my own thinking for a senior on a raw diet is eating a high raw, but including some cooked legumes to help with this issue. Certainly you can eat sprouted lentils, but you need to eat such a volume of them to meet your protein requirements. You can eat a lot of hemp seeds and pumpkin seeds, and there are a few other legumes you can sprout, like peas, for example. But large legumes you can't eat just sprouted. They contain lectins, hemagglutinins, which can be quite toxic. And if you eat sprouted kidney beans, you'll get very, very sick. So it really is more challenging to meet nutritional requirements on 100% raw diet. That doesn't mean to say it can't be done, but over the long term, what I have seen is people start to lose their hair. They start to lose muscle. They have some skin fragility. They bruise and their skin breaks and bruises easily. If they get sick, they have a longer recovery time. They get tired. They don't fight infections as well. They have poor wound healing, sometimes mood changes. And those are often signs of protein and iron deficiency. And so if you're seeing that, then I would say at the very least, add some cooked lentils or cook like a lentil soup or something every day. And that would help a lot. Protein needs tend to increase as we age. The RDA is 0.8 grams per kilogram body weight. Most experts now say 1 to 1.2 grams for older adults, and even higher, up to 1.5 grams per kilogram for those who have a chronic illness or who have sarcopenia, which is muscle loss. And so I've seen a number of, I'm getting off into another topic, into the protein topic now, but I've actually seen a number of whole food plant-based women who are eating 35, 40 grams of protein a day because they don't consume that many calories. It's not enough. They start to get these symptoms. And so when we boost their protein intake to, say, 60 grams a day or 70 grams a day, all of these things tend to reverse and they do quite well. So this is the same concern for someone who's 100% raw. Often in the beginning, you feel so good because it is such a clean diet. It's low in contaminants, especially if you're favoring organic foods and you're not consuming any ultra processed garbage. It's just a really therapeutic diet. But there's a spectrum of, sort of on both sides of falling a little short of nutrients versus, having exposure to these less or more problematic foods, less healthful foods. And so just a little more caution is needed with a fully raw food diet.
What target do you recommend for calcium? Circling back to calcium, what range are you expecting people to get?
In terms of what they're consuming each day?
No, in terms of levels of calcium, like if you had a blood work test.
Blood calcium levels are maintained within a very, very small range because as soon as your calcium levels drop, you die. So you get cardiac arrhythmias, you get like your body controls calcium levels in your blood. Blood tests are pretty much useless for calcium because as soon as you get slightly low in blood calcium levels, you just draw calcium from your bones so you can survive. You test your sort of calcium status by testing your bone health more than your calcium blood levels.
What are some examples of people who have seen significant health improvements that you've noticed or have helped along the way after switching to a plant-based diet?
I'll never forget a fellow from the Marshall Islands that had a blood sugar of over 300 milligrams per deciliter, who got it down to normal within fairly short order. But probably though, he got it down to under 100 milligrams per deciliter, which was just amazing for him. But maybe the one that sticks in my mind the most strongly is a fellow by the name of Carlos, and he was diagnosed with type 2 diabetes when he was 50. And for the next 20 years, he was taking 35 to 40 units of insulin and 17 pills a day. He had coronary heart disease. He had already had a heart attack. He had high blood pressure. His kidneys were starting to fail. He had peripheral artery disease. He had chronic gout 6 or 7 times a year. He had cataracts. He had the works. He had it all. And his physicians, including his endocrinologist, told him that, these were all chronic degenerative diseases that were irreversible, that, and he just believed that there was nothing he could do that would ever change any of that. And then his oldest son was diagnosed with cancer. And I can remember meeting his son at this conference, at John McDougall's conference. And he asked me if I could help him to design a diet that would give him the best chance of surviving this cancer. So I said, with cancer, there's no guarantees, but I'll help you. I love what Esselstyn often says is, stop pouring gasoline on the fire. And that's basically what I can help you to stop pouring gasoline on the fire and give you the best chance that you can have. So we designed a completely whole food, fairly high raw plant-based diet, all organic. I mean, just really quite a stellar diet. His mom and dad decided to support him by eating the same way he did. And about a year after they did that, Carlos, from taking, 35, 40 units of insulin and 17 pills a day, was taking 0 insulin and 0 pills. His fasting glucose went down to about 80 to 87 milligrams per deciliter, A1C to 5.1. His blood pressure on no medication was 115/70. He was taking 2 medications for blood pressure and couldn't get it within the normal range. He had a PET scan which showed his arteries opened up, and even the scar tissue had shrunk in his heart. His kidney function returned to normal. He reversed his peripheral artery disease. All of these conditions that he was told were progressive and irreversible disappeared. And he went into his doctor and said, why didn't you tell me this was possible just by changing my diet and starting to exercise? And his doctor responded, I didn't tell you this was possible because I didn't know this was possible. He said, I wouldn't have believed it if I hadn't seen it myself. And so that was, one of the most, amazing, most amazing responses that.
That's incredible. Oh my God.
Good.
Wow.
So, yeah. And, thinking about TSH again, the only thing I can really think of is to, make sure you're getting enough iodine. So getting the sources of iodine or an iodine supplement, and then being a little bit cautious about, goitrogens in some cases. Goitrogens are more of an issue if you're not getting enough iodine. Goitrogens are in cruciferous vegetables and flax seeds and some soy foods and things like that. Generally, if you get enough iodine, you don't have to worry about those. And the other thing to know is that cooking does reduce goitrogenic activities in cruciferous vegetables and such. So that's another thing just to be aware of. And then the other things are iron and zinc are important for thyroid function. And so again, just making sure you're getting enough of those. So those are the things that I just, think of.
Here's another question that we have from our studio audience. The I've noticed as of recent, I seem to be losing more hair than I used to. She's 70 years old and has been whole food plant-based for 2 years.
It usually boils down to protein and iron. Just to give you an example of some of the things that I do. So when I prepare my breakfast bowl in the morning, and my breakfast bowl is a lot of fruit, and then I have some grains that I add, and then chia pudding, which is a fortified unsweetened soy milk, and chia seeds, of course, and some prunes blended up in there. But the other thing that I do is when I cook my grains, so if I'm cooking oat groats or kamut berries or spelt berries or, sometimes it's a combination of oat groats and quinoa and sorghum, for example, I always add in lentils. And people might think that sounds weird in a breakfast bowl, but adding lentils are a fantastic source of iron and protein. They're also a fantastic source of fiber, of course, but adding that, you don't even notice it in your breakfast bowl. So if I use a cup of grains to cook, I would use about a quarter to a third of a cup of lentils. And I find that's a wonderful way of adding the protein and iron to breakfast, and choosing soy milk as opposed to almond milk or something that has very little protein boosts protein in the meal. I aim for at least 20 grams of protein for each meal. And then at lunchtime, just adding some little tofu cubes or some beans and hummus to your salad, but also making a dressing that's got some nutritional value. So I always, start with tahini, but add lots of hemp seeds and, just good food to the dressing. And then just being very aware at dinner that you've got the legumes as part of the mix. So I think legumes. And as we get older, I find I'm eating less grains and more legumes, less grains and starchy vegetables and more legumes, because I can't afford as many calories. So that's one of the ways that I manage to maintain my weight where I want it, is to, I eat more non-starchy vegetables and legumes and a little less of the concentrated carbohydrate.
So our last question for tonight is, what are three things that someone can do to help start this journey?
Well, I would think number one, educate yourself. And educating yourself by taking a course, by getting some books like the books I write and reading them, by listening to Dr. Greger's nutrition facts, by, they're listening to going to some of the conferences, the Plantrition Project, the NHA conferences. There are all kinds of fabulous conferences with great speakers. I think that's number one. And number two is to, just take it a step at a time. Start simple, focus on meals that are familiar, easy to prepare, use whole plant foods, but don't feel like you have to do it all perfectly overnight. None of us are perfect. Make the goal just being on the path, taking each little baby step is worth celebrating. So, and then I think the third thing to me is to find community, to connect with others who are like-minded, connections that you'll form with people that are doing what you're doing. Plant-based groups online, whatever work they're doing in the plant-based world, just align yourself with those kinds of individuals. And and of course, it's not just about food. It's not even just about reclaiming your health. It's about aligning your values with, with everything that you do, and contributing to a world that's more compassionate, more sustainable, and healthier. So all of those things.
Well, I have to say, especially about the communities, especially having local meetup groups, because here on Cape Cod, we're part of what's called Building Healthy Communities, which started out to be from Plant Pure Nation. They created what they called the pods for many years, and they were not able to continue to support that. So they transitioned all of those people over to PCRM, and it's called now Building Healthy Communities. So they have a updated map now of all the current communities that are working and going, and they're strong. So across the United States, and I think there's some places around the world as well. And there's more coming. I mean, each day they take applications from people that are starting local groups, and then they help support each other. We have mentors, to help people that are just starting out. So it's a fabulous group, and I can't say enough. I mean, PCRM, what can I say? They're
Yeah, they're
at the
doing wonderful work.
yeah, Physicians Committee for Responsible Medicine is just absolutely amazing. So it's called Building Healthy Communities. We are Plant-Based Cape Cod on the map.
Isn't that wonderful?
Yeah.
Enjoy.
Yes.
Wish I could come.
I wish you could too. Anytime. I have an open door. Come visit. And anytime, honestly, Brenda, I would love to have you come down here to the Cape because it's amazing. It's so beautiful. So
Oh,
anyway, thank you so much for taking the time to connect
you're
with us
so
tonight.
welcome. I'm so glad to meet everyone and to be a part of the evening. And thank you so much for inviting me.
And thank you, everybody, tonight for joining us because I know you have a lot to do. We're all incredibly busy, but to take an hour out of your night, your week, I'm very grateful.